Travels and Adventures of Little Baron Trump and His Wonderful Dog, Bulgar. Chapter 2 has an illustration, the muzzled mules. The one closest to you has pointy ears that go up, and the one furthest away has pointy ears that point away from the direction its mouth points, and both have cloths wrapped multiple times around their mouths. The elder baron, uncertain as to the exact locality of my birth. Reasons why will be given later. My parents traveling in Africa at this time, the elder baron's remarkable ascent of the mountains of the moon, miraculous escape from the impenetrable fog, how accomplished in the land of the melodious sneezers, all that happened there, how the king of the melodious sneezers conducted my parents in great honor to his palace, and how they were treated by him. What lies within my power to gratify the curiosity of my readers as to what part of the world it was in which I first saw darkness, for I was born in the night, yet as to the nature of the immediate spot on which I was born, unfortunately I am able to do more than repeat my father's words when questioned as to this point. My son, if I were on my deathbed, I could only say, thou wert either born in the center, in a great lake, on an island, upon a peninsula, or on the top of a very high mountain, as I have often explained to thee. Let it suffice then, general reader, for the present, for me to inform you that at the time of my birth, my parents were traveling in Africa, that my father had just successfully accomplished one of the most wonderful feats in mountain climbing, namely the ascent of the loftiest peak of the mountains of the moon, and that his guides had abandoned him upon reaching a particularly dangerous spot in the ascent, but that he had pushed forward without them, and reached the summit after several days of terrible privation, suffering both hunger and thirst, it being a peculiarity of the atmosphere after passing a certain height, that the muscles of the face and throat became paralyzed, and the unfortunate traveler either perishes from hunger or thirst while in the very presence of delicious fruit and cool, limpid water. Upon rejoining my mother, who had accompanied him as far up the mountainside as the best trained and most sure-footed mules could find a foothold, they proceeded to make their way, as they supposed, to the valley from which they had first set out. An impenetrable fog now shut them in, and they soon found themselves hopelessly and helplessly wandering about. On the morning of the third day, the fog had even increased in thickness, closing around them like a pall, almost shutting out the light of day. While groping about, my father had come into contact with the two beasts of burden, which had served him in the easier parts of the ascent. They were quietly and unconcernedly browsing upon the sweet and tender shrubs which grew on the mountainside. Secondly, an idea came to my father. It was born of that desperation which makes a man think long and hard before lying down to die. It was thus, he reasoned, if these animals are permitted to eat their fill whenever their appetites demand, they will be quite willing to stay where they are, especially when they find themselves surrounded by such excellent pastures, and, in addition thereto, quite relieved from all toil. Let them, however, feel the pangs of hunger, or better yet, starvation's tooth at their vitals, and their thoughts will at once revert to their homes, their masters, their feeding troughs, and they will lose no time in setting out for the village where they belong. With the energy of despair, my father hurriedly bound a piece of canvas over their mouths so that they could neither graze nor drink, and awaited the results of his experiment. With bated breath, for the tears and groans of my poor mother, whose strength was fast ebbing away, smote him to the very soul. After a few hours, the animals rose to their feet and became very restive, and in another hour, their hunger had so increased that they were making frantic efforts to feed, as my father could easily tell from the jerking of the line which he had been careful to attach to their headstalls. After the fourth hour, there was a long silence, during which the animals seemed to be deliberating as to what course they should pursue. The fifth hour came. My mother had sunk to rest, weak and weary, in my father's arms. Suddenly there was a tightening of the guiding lines. Gently my father aroused his sleeping mate, whispered a few words of comfort. Again the lines tightened. My parents were now on their feet, peering into the depths of the impenetrable fog which shrouded them about and made them even invisible to each other. Hist! The animals move again. With a sudden impulse, as if their minds had at last solved the problem which had been bewildering them for several hours, the beasts, with violent snortings, turned from the spot, pushing through the shrubbery and causing my parents to face quite about. Evidently, there was a complete accord between the conclusions reached by their intelligence or instinct, for not once did they pull apart or come to a halt, except when restrained by my father, and thus my dear parents were saved. All that day and part of the next did they pursue their dreary way. The fog at last lifted, and it was at once apparent to my father that, although the animals were guiding them towards human habitations, yet it was not the land he had quitted upon starting out upon the journey to the mountain peak. The path now became so plainly visible that my father removed the improvised muzzles from the two animals and allowed them to satisfy their hunger, which they proceeded to do with the keenest relish. So worn out was my mother that she sank helpless to the ground, refreshing her with the draught of spring water and the juice of some wild grapes. My father hastily prepared a bed of soft foliage, upon which they were both glad to throw themselves after their long and weary tramp. They had soon fallen into a deep and most delightful sleep. How long they lay on their leafy bed, wrapped in the refreshing slumber, they knew not. It certainly was for many a long hour, for when they awoke, hunger was gnawing at their stomachs. Fain would they have at once proceeded to gather fruit, had not their ears been suddenly saluted with most extraordinary noises. They rubbed their eyes and looked about and at each other, deeming themselves the sport of some merry Jack-a-dreamer. But no, they were wide awake and in full possession of their senses. Again the strange sounds are heard, and this time they are nearer and clearer. There is a rise and a fall, a swelling out, and then a dying away. The sounds are jerky and snappy like, and there is a singular music in them. Nearer and still nearer they come. Louder and still louder they grow. Wild beasts? Whispered my mother, half inquiringly. Nay, falls from my father's lips. Not unless human beings may be so wild as to merit the name of beasts. Hark again, murmured my mother. There was no mistaking the sounds any longer, for like a chorus of many voices, shrill and piping, deep and grumbling, soft and musical, harsh and guttural, yet all in a sort of rude and wild harmony, mingling in one mighty strain, now low and scarcely audible, and now breaking out with a fierce and seemingly threatening vigor. The singers, chanters, howlers, or what they might be, rushed into the valley below us in a wild and yet half-regulated disorder. They were human beings in savage garb, with painted faces and clubs swung lightly across their shoulders. Whether pausing or advancing, they still kept up their wild and mysterious chant. Choppy, jerky, and snappy, for all the world like 1,000 people who had just drawn plentifully from 1,000 snuff boxes. Save me, husband, cried my mother, with pallid face. We shall be put to some awful torture by these wild children of the forest. A smile so gentle and yet so calm that it could not fail to be reassuring spread over my father's features. Never fear, said he. I know them. I've been seeking them. What has been denied many a traveler stronger and bolder than I has been accorded to a member of the Trump family in the most miraculous manner. When we return to Europe, every monarch, every learned society will hasten to bind a medal on my breast. For, dear wife, your husband is the first white man to enter the land of the echoes my mother, leaning forward and grasping her husband's arm. Melodious sneezers. Melodious sneezers, repeated my mother, with wide-opened eye and amusement seated in every feature. But she could not go further. She could get no further. To my father's infinite amusement, she fell a-sneezing most violently. In such rapid succession did the sneezes flow that it sounded exactly like a diminutive engine under full headway. At last, the fit seemed to have passed. But in vain she could not reach the second syllable. And now in his turn my father started off, slow at first, but going faster and faster. Strange to say, their sneezing soon began to catch the ways of the country, and blended thoroughly, keeping time in spite of their efforts to check it. Know then, dear wife, cried my father, pantingly, when his fit was over, that those strange people stretched on the greensward below are the melodious sneezers. That they are not only perfectly harmless, but gentle, kind, and peaceable to an astonishing degree. Fear them not, their clubs are only for game. But why? Asked my mother, warily, lest another fit should take her. I understand thee, was the reply. Listen, know that in this valley, and in the greater ones below, The air is always filled with myriads upon myriads of insects and infinitesimal size. Only the strongest microscope can give proof to your sight of their actual existence. For countless generations, these peaceable barbarians here have been subjected to the tickling sensations which you and I have. Again, my poor parent fell a-sneezing in regular and musical cadences, up and down, deep and shrill, now fast and faster, now slow and slower, until silence reigned again. Just experienced, resumed my father, until it has rendered the effort of sneezing quite as easy as breathing, and taking advantage of results which they soon discerned could not be avoided. These children of nature were not slow to lay aside their usual speech and literally talk by sneezes. With them, a sneeze is capable of so many intonations and so many inflections that they find no difficulty in expressing all the necessary feelings and sensations, at least necessary for them in their simple lives, as you shall see later on. Fain would my poor mother here express her passing wonder, but she dare not open her mouth. Come, dearest mate, cried my father gaily, joyously. Courage, let us descend into this beautiful valley, for as yet we are only standing upon the borders of the land of the melodious sneezers, called in their soft and musical tongue La-a-chula. The pronunciation of this word again threw my poor parents into a perfect whirlwind of sneezes, but nothing daunted, they advanced to meet the natives, who at first sight fell prostrate on their faces, and for several moments kept up a low, plaintive hum of sneezes, with their noses thrust into the grass. By degrees, however, my father succeeding in convincing them that he was quite as peaceably inclined as they were, whereupon the melodious sneezers performed a most singular and withal pleasing dance of joy, their feet keeping perfect time with their chorus of sneezing. As my father afterwards learned, the dance was to express their intense gratitude to the white spirits for not having eaten them alive. The march homeward was now entered upon, my father walking hand in hand with the King Chuchulo, and my mother escorted by a score or more of his wives, the favorite of the royal house being named Chula-a-a-a-a, and each successive one according as she occupied a less lofty place in the king's affections, having a shorter name, until at last Chula signified little better than a mere serving maid. My father found that the villages of the melodious sneezers, on account of the frequency and the violence of inundations from the network of rivers, which completely shut in their land, consisted of houses or habitations built in the trees or upon lofty piles. He and my mother were lodged in one of the most commodious of the royal dwellings, and so many slaves and attendants were assigned to care for their wants that there was little or no room to move about. To their great sorrow, my father proceeded to dismiss several hundred in order that he might get close enough to my mother to converse without halloaing, and then sent word to King Chu-Chu-Lo that both he and my mother would need at least a week of perfect rest and quiet to regain their health and strength after their terrible sufferings on the slopes of the mountains of the moon. And can't help but feel there's some symbolic value in some of those elements the mountains of the moon and the mules and the tribe of singers. Sounds like fairies, doesn't it?